Welcome to the Agile Localization Podcast by Crowden, where we unpack the strategies and solutions that make localization fast, scalable, and efficient. I'm your host, Stefan Huyghe. Good morning and welcome to the Agile Localization Podcast by Crowden. I have the honor to have my good friend Julio Madrid from Walmart with me. And Julio, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and give us your background a little bit so people know who you are.
Sure. First of all, thank you, Stefan, for the invitation, for having me. And it is always an honor to talk to you. Well, I am Julio Madrid. I'm a localization specialist and an LSP owner from Mexico. I came into the localization industry, I think, like most of us, by mistake or by chance. I started back in 2004. 2003, 2004. I studied geopolitics and Romance languages in college, and right after that, it it was in the aftermath of 9/11. I was part of a special intelligence task force in the United Nations in coordination with the U.S. government. So I joined this task force, and I was sent to the Middle East and Europe. But after a couple of years of the isolation and the crazy work in intelligence, I was ready to switch and go back to normal. So I begged my direct manager back then to change me to a different position, to any desk job. And she said, well, all we have is an editorial translator back in New York. And I said, I'll take it. I just want to go back. So I went to New York, back to the HQ in New York for the UN, and started working in translation. And then I moved back to Mexico and discovered localization and the beauty of it. So I fell in love with it, and that's almost 21 years now. And that's why I've been doing pretty much what I've been doing pretty much this time. In 2014, I created a small company called Castani Language Solutions, a small LSP in Mexico City. And now localization is my 24/7 and what occupies my mind every day.
That's fascinating. I think there's at least half of the people that work in localization that stumbled into it, and I'm one of those as well. But I'll save my story for offline one of these days. Today we're talking about building bridges and connecting localization with product and development teams. And let's dive into the topic right away, Julio. How do you think localization can be embedded into the product development life cycle from the start?
I think that's like the $1 million question in our industry. And the most successful stories or approaches I've seen is what I call localization by design, which means making internationalization and localization part of the product requirements, or the product, the content, or the service requirements from day one. And in practice, that means, having localization experts or at least a localization team lead in the initial planning meetings, reviewing wireframes, providing input on design decisions, and working together with UX designers when the copy creation part starts. And for example, it's important to make sure that the UI for the project can handle text expansion and text contraction, and implementing proper string externalization and designing together with the cultural nuances that need to be embedded in the product's early stages. So when you do these, it's well documented now that the return on investment is huge, and you avoid costly redesigns, you reduce technical debt, and you speed up the time to market for international releases, or when you're pushing for updates in products, apps, and software. It is always cheaper to build it and embed it since the beginning than to do it later, or as we usually say, to do localization as an afterthought.
Yeah, and that's It's not always easy, I would think, to get a seat at the table right at the beginning of the production cycle. How do companies like Walmart foster a culture where localization is viewed as an essential part of the workflow and of product development?
That's a pretty good question. I am really passionate about this, and I think it applies to any small startup starting, just launching or beginning, or any small company, or any of the 500 Fortune companies. It's for me, it's as I said, one of my passions because if you share these knowledge and this passion with data, together with data numbers and hard data on the international potential for revenue of what localization means in a product, in a software, or in a service, if you also offer competitive analysis, the user global feedback, um, numbers talk. Numbers don't lie. And connecting, for me, it always worked connecting localization to revenue growth. And that it's always well received upstairs by the leadership. And it applies, as I said, to any company. So I think any successful company that wants to make localization part of the DNA or part of the company and the processes, they need to create champions across teams. I've seen great success stories of what I call localization ambassadors. It's people from all the departments, engineering, data science, and localization and UX design as well, who become evangelists for global first thinking. The global first thinking, it turns into, a philosophy, because when you're designing or you created a product that actually has in mind the finish line, that it's going to be globalized and not launch and then we will see if it will be localized or not. And finally, it's very important for companies to invest in education, to have workshops for new hires, create accessible documentation, and share that documentation and case studies of both, successes and failure stories, especially failures, because those are the ones that we learn the most. And it's important in these cross-functional teams that when, developers understand why text might expand 30% more in German compared to the source in English, or when they understand why the date format it's so important for the Mexican market, they actually make better decisions from the beginning. So it's a long game, but localization, when it becomes part of the company's DNA and part of the infrastructure and foundation, you see a huge advantage from product architecture to customer satisfaction.
Now, it sounds like you have a pretty mature localization philosophy there. Nevertheless, I know that often with people at maybe smaller organizations, the communication doesn't go as smoothly. What are the most common communication battles between localization and accessibility or the development team? Sorry.
The one that I would say it's the most obvious, or the one that comes first to mind, is the technical knowledge gap. Localization specialists usually are not immersed or don't fully grasp or understand the constraints of, code programming, Python, or technical basic concepts. And the developers, sometimes it's hard for them to grasp the linguistic aspects of what localization specialists work with. So the main one would be a disconnection in understanding that both teams are trying to achieve the same goal, which is to get to a user, to the final user, the best way possible. So when you combine these teams and team leads join together and understand that the main goal is actually shared by both teams, those type of frictions are easily, solved. So there's a few barriers that come into mind, but that would be for me the most significant, the technical knowledge gap. So I would recommend localization linguists to try to take a small course online or immerse into Python code programming and technical lingo, and to develop.
It's always good. It's always good to speak your target audience's language, I would say, and that falls right into it. That tracks right.
Absolutely. And especially when you're trying to evangelize a someone who is the decision maker in the developer team, you need to speak the language. So know your audience.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good piece of advice, I think. How do you think localization can provide value beyond just translation? I think so many times we're just stuck in the translation box, so to speak, and there's other opportunities maybe in UX or accessibilities improvements. What do you think?
You just said it right now. It's about understanding the audience and speaking their language, putting yourself in their own shoes. We use that analogy a lot. Localization for me isn't just about translating words or changing meanings. It's about adapting the product, the service, or the content for different markets and cultures. So first, localization teams have unique insights into the user experience across markets. Usually, we are more than bilingual talent. We have experience in both cultures, and we, as localization specialists, can identify when a feature that works in one market might not necessarily work in another, due to cultural differences or government regulations. So it's important to provide always the space for localization specialists and localization teams to share their value, to share their knowledge. And it's always they always have so much to contribute, like marketing research or intelligence research, when they know so much in the background because they grew up with that language, and they can provide intel and insight that sometimes it's hard for marketing or research to get to understand without any A/B testing or any market research.
Very, very interesting. We've gone almost 15 minutes without talking about AI, so we can't avoid it that much longer. I think um, a quick AI question. How does AI and automation assist in accelerating your localization process, and what's your philosophy on it? How do you avoid errors, and how is it being implemented at Walmart?
You know, AI and automation are transforming our industry, to say the least. But I think they're tools, and you and I, we've been in the industry for a while. We've seen so many changes and phases and new tools and new trends back when we had machine translation introduced in the market, and then neural machine translations. So for me, they are tools. Uh, they are not magic bullets or magic ones yet. And the key is knowing where and how to apply them. So, for high volume, lower risk content, maybe user generated content or support documentation for teams, machine translation with human post edited can dramatically increase, quality and increase revenue and save money, while also keeping a good quality of the final product. So the trick is pairing, for me, the trick is pairing the robust quality that you can get with, implementing AI together with a set of human eyes. It has to be supervised. Quality assurance has to be on the side of humans. And we're also seeing, huge gains in automating file handling and workflows, which is actually a great feature that I really enjoy with Crowdin implementing these features into the system. And system can now be automatically, set up in an automatic way that they can extract content, they can reintegrate it into the process without the manual intervention of a human. And this eliminates wait times, this eliminates frictions, and this reduces errors by a great deal. We're not there yet in the place where errors will be completely avoided, but it's getting there. And keeping the human connection and the human involvement in this process is completely paramount for me.
It's nice to make them work in synchronicity, so to speak, and Crowden has put in a lot of features as of late that work towards that. I was talking to Jan Hendricks earlier this week in Mexico, and he was telling me about a feature that he really loves that allows the translators to get prompts that indicate there's an issue or that something might have to be QA'd. And that kind of help, I think, speeds up the process a lot, wouldn't you think?
You mean already implemented in Crowding right now?
In crowd and yeah.
I haven't used that one.
I will have to show you. I'll show you offline, Julio. There's new features being introduced all the time. What do you think are the best practices for including localization? I think you're an agile localization company as well, and you do weekly sprints. So, what are the best practices for including localization in your sprint planning and roadmaps?
As an Agile alumni, a PM, Agile PM certificate alumni, I think the Agile process for me is really important, and including localization in the sprint planning, it must be a must. It has to be essential for actually getting a real, truly agile localization. I've used a framework that we call localization racetrack, and we call it racetrack because it reminds me of the horses race, the race for horses, when they have to stick in one lane and not cross to the other lane, but they have to get to the same goal and same finish line. It includes localization tasks in the weekly or monthly sprints in the sprint backlog with clear owners. It's very important to define clear owners and define clear estimates and expectations. If you're developing a new feature, you should have stories for, you know, internationalization architecture, string extractions, translation, and localization, and give space for show and tell. I call it show and tell when you give space for members to share what they've been improving or if they've done during the last sprint and the new one. Also, build in an overlap between sprint for localization work. That means, while developers might move on to the next feature or the next step in the localization or on the development process, localization is still working in the previous feature that is still in progress. So if you allow this sort of synchronicity, this creates a continuous flow rather than waiting for some part of the progress to be done and then take over. I love the examples that you usually use on the podcast when back then when we had to wait for the Excel spreadsheet, someone else to close it on the other side of the room so we could start working on it. That's
I see
something.
you've been watching the show.
Yes,
You
I
remember it.
see.
That's very good. I'm
That's
honored.
actually yes, it's one of my favorite shows, and my team shares it, and every episode we get, we're discussing it. So it's we see you, we're fans. So this is important. If you do it in an agile process, in an agile design, I also use something that I call it's well known in the agile um, um, frameworks, the T-shirt sizing, like large, medium, small, and extra large. When you use the t-shirt sizing for localization complexities during the backlog grooming, you set up the idea and the expectation, and some features might be simple, from a code perspective and get it out of the way by the developers, but not necessarily as easy and are more complex for localization. So as a program manager, project manager, when you have that into consideration in an agile process, that gives you an advantage. You save a lot of time.
Yeah. And anybody's ever been in a sprint meeting knows that sometimes there's delays and roadblocks even What strategies do you employ internally to help minimize those delays? And when you're localizing frequent product updates, I can imagine that there's a lot of stress that you need to overcome. What's the strategy there, Julio?
Just imagine, when there are so many departments and different tiers of management involved and decision makers, and sometimes, it's not necessarily because of a workflow or a productivity issue. It's more of what I call bureaucratic issue that might be a delay of what's causing a delay. But in my experience, keeping pace with frequent updates is it's one of the biggest challenges, when you're pushing regular updates, because it requires a multifaceted and a multi-team approach. And one of the strategies I would recommend is, implementing a how do you I forgot the name of the term. It's a multi-tier approach that eliminates the wait between the development and the localization kickoff. It's part of the smart prioritization. Not all content, as we say in the industry, not all content is created equally. So you need to have, and this is very important, you need to have a triage system that identifies what is going to be user-facing string that might blog release versus content that can be updated later or after launch or after the update is deployed. And this might mean, releasing some features in the source language, in this case in English, and have the user interface with English only strings initially, but then updating them or localizing them. And that's okay because you need first to decide what is the paramount, what's more important to be localized and to be included. And then when you apply, and this is sometimes very obvious, and we all know it, but believe me, we sometimes forget. It's applying the translation memory and the machine translation effectively. It's an understatement that sometimes we don't. It's so obvious for most of us, but sometimes we don't. So for incremental updates, usually the content is similar to existing translations. So when you do good use of the translation memory, it dramatically automatizes and decreases friction by speeding up the process. Also, if you implement a parallel workflow, what I was saying about the horse racetrack or car racetrack, a parallel workflow rather than waiting for the entire product to be ready, you start localizing content as they are completed by sections. That requires a good segmentation of the content and a very clear ownership. That is, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to have a clear ownership.
It's good to know who's the boss in the end. We're we're going to veer into one of my favorite areas. I've been a LangOps pioneer for almost 2 years now, and we've been drawing the parallels with DevOps for a while now, and have predicted that the localization industry is going to be going that direction. So I want to know what lessons can you draw from DevOps and CI/CD that can be applied to localization?
When you've been in the industry enough, you are lucky enough to see that DevOps actually revolutionized the software development industry. And those same principles, as you mentioned, we're going there, those same principles can be applied and transform localization. I am an advocate for that 100%. I see in this comparison, I see three key lessons that might apply, directly to the work we do on a daily basis. First is to continue the integration. Just as code is, usually integrated and tested, localization should also be a continuous process rather than a big bang effort that you do at the end of the launch or that comes after everyone is done in the development. This means to implement system that automatically detect new content, route it for translation, and integrate the results back without human intervention. And Crowdin has revolutionized that, especially with the plugins and implementations that are embedded in the platform. Also, it's focus on automation and tooling. Keeping in mind that this is for localization, dev teams, they invest heavily and they invest a lot of automation, a lot of time in automation to eliminate manual steps and reduce errors. And in localization, this would mean automating the file handling, doing the quality checks, and deployment for the translated and localized content. So the goal here is to remove human touch points as much as possible. That's not a very popular approach, but that actually gives us the liberty and time to focus on content, not so much on the process. So eliminate the human touch points as much as possible, but never from where they add real value in the process. And DevOps do a great job on that. The third or last, I'm not even sure what number I'm in right now, but the next one would be emphasis on measuring and feedback loops. The developers, the DevOps teams, they really, really pay attention to metrics and identify bottlenecks ahead of time and work on improving the process. That's something that I really admire and enjoy. Localization teams should also track metrics, keep KPIs, like translation through output, time to market, time to launch, and quality scores to continuously improve. That's pretty much easily said, but in reality, this means treating localization, in my opinion, treating localization as code. You know, your strings should be in version control, your workflows should be automated, and your quality checks should be systematic and reproducible. You should always be able to reproduce them regardless of the project. I've seen teams already implement this, as you mentioned earlier. Some call it lockups, and it's amazing when you do that same process and you copy, because we copy DevOps. You get up to the cycle is reduced by 75%. If I remember right, the latest crowding um, research on this, it was about 75% in improving quality and reducing the time cycle. So let's all advocate for DevOps in localization.
Yeah, that sounds really, really good, and it sounds like you have a real good handle on the way you run that at Walmart. How do integrations help out in the localization workflow? I know Crowden has integrations with GitHub and GitLab and Bitbucket. That's just to name a few. How do those work out for you?
I think I mentioned earlier, those are for me one of my favorite features of crowding, and what I think it's one of their main strengths. These integrations and plugins are a game changer for continuous localization and in achieving a real agile process. What they do is pretty much they remove the friction between the code changes and updates and the translation updates and localization updates. It makes it work flawlessly and without friction. And you must know, in the old world, I've been in this for 21 years now, since 2004. So in the old world, you must remember, you have this painful process of manually extracting strings and sending them off to for localization, back for translation back then, and then have them back weeks later if you were lucky, and then trying to manually integrating them into the embedded process. And that often leading, to conflicts, headaches. And for me personally, that was a nightmare.
Yeah, I was just thinking, from a time perspective, what do your turnaround cycles look like right now in comparison with those long weekly turnaround times back in the day?
Oh, with that's a really good question. With direct integrations, if you use the version control system and you are, in control of the whole process and the whole system, and you have a setting, and specifically in crowding, a setting that is already understood by everyone involved in the process. And so when a developer pushes a code with new strings, the system automatically detects them and send them for localization and adaptation. And then it creates an automatic pull request. So these have massive benefits. And when everyone is online and everything is, synced, it can take 2 minutes for a string to be processed. What usually would take 2, 3 days, it can now be done in 3, 4 minutes. It also depends if you're working with vendors or an LSP that's a service provider or a contractor. If they are connected at the same time through these integrations, they get automatically an instant notifications, you will know. And this makes the production and translation a lot faster. They get tested and they get actually embedded of the same CI/CD pipeline as the code would be, and that's amazing. That's actually, I enjoyed that now, and it's people that come into the industry right now, and for them it's a given. This speed and this ease of working in a platform that allows you to have all these, they don't really understand what it was before. So life cycles and project cycles have reduced dramatically.
Fascinating. Julio, you're not going to believe it, but we were already a couple of minutes over. So I'm going to thank you for all your insights. We should have you on a second time and talk some more. I think there's lots of content that we can continue with. Thank you very much for joining the Agile Localization Podcast this morning. And we're going to keep an eye on you and pay attention to the latest developments. I appreciate your input.
Thank you so much, Stefan. Thank you.
Well, folks, that's a wrap on today's episode of the Agile Localization Podcast by Crowden. We hope you found it as insightful as we did. If you enjoyed today's conversation and want to learn more about how leading companies are managing their multilingual content efficiently, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming episodes. Thank you for tuning in. For more resources on how to streamline your localization process, visit crowden.com. See you next time.